Hey y'all, it's Jon Ray, and today I'm doing a mystical interpretation of Genesis 3:14 through 24, the moment when Adam and Eve are cast out of Eden. But this isn't a story about an angry God kicking humans out of paradise. This is a story about what happens when you create from separation, when you react from fear, and when you let judgment override your inner knowing. Neville Goddard taught that you are always in a state of consciousness, and Eden is itself a state of consciousness. That's what it represents. You don't get kicked out of Eden, you fall out of it. But the good news is you can return. So in this video, we're going to break down what happens when you leave Eden and how we can find our way back. So let's go verse by verse. Genesis 3:14 through 15 says, Yahweh God said to the serpent, because you have done this, you are cursed. I will put hostility between you and the woman. Her offspring will bruise your head, and you will bruise his heel. So the serpent, as we talked about in our last video, is doubt, judgment, separation. And that's now at odds with our subconscious, which is Eve. And this is what happens when the subconscious starts reacting to external stimuli in physical reality rather than trusting the original assumption of God's promise. And from this point on, you're in internal conflict. You want to believe in God's promise, but doubt keeps snapping at your heels. And we've all probably felt this. You set an intention, but fear creeps in the next morning. You visualize and see something in prayer, but then start to spiral in self-comparison, or something happens in your world that you justify somehow that, oh, God's promise can't possibly solve for this. And so you make the thing that you're observing more important than the promise. And this is the bruised heel. But there's also hope in this verse. It says her offspring will crush the serpent's head. That means your creation still has the power to override doubt if you can stay in the state of the assumption of God's promise. Genesis 3:16 says, to the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your pain. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. And so remember, Eve is the subconscious mind in the mystical interpretation of the Bible. So this verse isn't about, a woman being subservient to a man. It's about what's happening inside of you as you make choices and grapple with fear. And this verse symbolizes what happens when your subconscious is no longer partnered with the conscious mind, which is Adam, but is ruled by it. And the inner harmony is broken. You now feel disconnected because your subconscious and your conscious mind aren't in concert together. And desire then becomes painful because you're not believing that God can bring it to you. You're not believing in God's promise. And when you have a desire that you don't think you can fulfill, that's painful. Waiting becomes suffering, and you're no longer naked and ashamed. You're self-conscious and striving. The subconscious in this moment no longer receives gently. It longs, it craves, it aches. That's the pain of birth giving. And this is what manifestation looks like from separation. It's the hustle harder culture. It's slower, heavier, effortful. Yes, you can get there that way, but it's so much of an energy drain. Genesis 3:17 through 19 says, to Adam he said, cursed is the ground because of you. Through hard labor you will eat until you return to the ground, for you are dust. Now the conscious mind, Adam, is entering into the age of toil. That's that efforting that we were talking about. And that's because you've left flow and entered force. Everything must now be earned. Effort replaces ease. Hustle replaces trust. And that probably sounds familiar because that's what the world teaches us to do. You start a project, you're excited about it, you're inspired, but then you fall out of that state of inspiration and suddenly you're grinding, overthinking, trying to force results. This is the exile from Eden. You've moved from I am, an awareness where you're connecting with God's promise, to I must. And the more you push from fear, the more dust you taste. Genesis 3:20 says, "The man called his wife Eve because she was the mother of all living." What this represents is that even in exile, this verse is reminding us of something powerful. Creation still flows through you. You're still connected to the outcomes that you have in physical reality. And Eve, your subconscious, still brings life forward into reality around you. This is conscious manifestation. And even in your misalignment, you're still creative. You're still powerful. You're still capable of producing results. But without the garden state, that state of recognizing God's promise and claiming that territory for yourself, the process feels harder when you're not in that state. It feels slower. It feels heavier. And this verse is an invitation to return to the state of God's promise, to that assumption, to remember that the mother of all living is still inside you. You've just got to reconnect to her through assumption. And we do this by feeling our big feelings, transmuting those into creative potential, and reconnecting with God's promise, which is our assumption that God's hand is moving in our favor. Genesis 3:21 says, Yahweh God made garments of skins for Adam and his wife and clothed them. And this is the moment you go from being your state to covering your state. This is the facade that starts to form. You're no longer flowing from identity that you could claim inside God's promise, but now instead you're performing, you're doing a dance for the world around you. You're starting to build brands or businesses or relationships, but they're costumes. They're not embodiments of who you are in God, the larger identity that God has claimed for you. And, have you ever launched a project or something out of pressure instead of passion? Posted something to social media out of fear instead of flow, ran an ad campaign because you were so worried that nothing else was bringing in leads? That's the garment. It covers your shame, but it doesn't heal the source. This is when you buy that course for $3,000 and without even doing any of the coursework or any of the internal adjustment, you feel temporarily safe because you spent the money towards a solution, but you didn't integrate the solution. So you're just wearing a garment, and that garment covers the shame, but it doesn't heal the source. Many people do this with a literal interpretation of the Bible, where the literal interpretation of the Bible makes them feel good, but they're not actually doing any of the integrated work required to get back into the state, to really be aligned vibrationally with God's promise. And so they're just wearing a literal garment. And yes, it covers the shame, but it does not heal the source elements. It doesn't allow you to integrate the 12 tribes, 12 disciples, and 12 gates. You're still powerful, you're still loved, but you haven't returned home. You haven't returned to Eden yet. Genesis 3:22 through 24 says, He drove out the man and placed cherubim and a flaming sword to guard the way to the tree of life. This is the core mystical truth. The way back to Eden is guarded, not by God, but by your own internal resistance. The flaming sword equals your need to control, to judge, to prove. The cherubim equals your fear of surrender. You can't access the tree of life, your alignment with the promise, by pushing your way in. You return by surrender, by entering the Sabbath state again. Go and view our video on day 7 of the creation process so that you can understand what it means to surrender into rest, knowing that God's promise is working in your favor. By assuming your desire is already fulfilled and resting in that assumption of God's promise, you now have the ability to return to Eden. And when you do, when you return to that state, the garden reopens because the gate was never locked. It was just hidden behind all of the fear and base level energies and emotions that needed to be integrated. So let's anchor all this in with a prayer practice, and we'll call this one Return to Eden. This practice is for when you've been in a season of effort or control or discouragement. And when you're in that season, first, sit in stillness. Take a deep breath. The whole Bible is a map for returning back to presence and integrating anything that is out of alignment with God's promise. So in that place of quiet, Visualize the garden, and don't visualize it as a place, but as a feeling of peace, power, inner knowing. This is God's hand moving in your favor. And say to yourself, I'm returning to the state of I am. I'm expanding my awareness. I release judgment. I release striving. Let the sword fall. Let the gate open. Then simply sit there in quiet and notice what's happening in your body as sensation. Don't judge it. This isn't a process of trying to get information or to make something happen. It's a process of remembering that you already are everything you need to fulfill the promise that God has for you. In our next video, we'll begin the journey after Eden into the stories of Cain and Abel and the emotional energies of envy, projection, and comparison. We're going to see what happens when you believe somebody else's success means that there's less for you, which of course is a lie. To get an email when the next video is released or to request a Bible verse interpretation, go to BibleMystic.com. And if you've ever felt like you've been living outside your alignment, working harder than you need to, like, comment, and subscribe. Share down in the comments. What's your first step back to Eden right now? What are you ready to release? Feel those big feelings, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye, y'all.